Martha had always thought of the lake as her husband Robert's domain, a sacred place where he found peace amid the chaos of life. The fishing spot was their escape in the early days of their marriage, a place where they could sit quietly, let the world fade away, and talk about everything or nothing at all. But after Robert's passing, the lake became a source of pain. The idea of visiting it without him felt unbearable. For 20 years, she avoided it entirely. She didn't even look at the old fishing poles in the garage. But as her 80th birthday approached, she felt a strange pull to return. Perhaps it was nostalgia, or perhaps it was a desire for closure, but something inside her whispered that it was time to go back. One cool autumn morning, she packed a small bag with a thermos of tea, her favorite wool blanket, and Robert's old tackle box. It felt strange to carry his things, like holding onto a piece of him that had been frozen in time. When she arrived, the sight of the lake took her breath away. The stillness of the water, the faint rustle of the pines swaying in the breeze, and the familiar scent of moss and earth, all of it brought memories flooding back. She could almost hear Robert's laugh echoing across the water, his voice teasing her for never quite getting the hang of baiting a hook. Her knees creaked as she lowered herself onto the dock, her hands gripping the weathered planks for support. She sat there for what felt like hours, letting the memories wash over her. The gentle waves lapping at the dock seemed to speak to her, as if the lake itself remembered their years spent there together. She sipped her tea and whispered to the empty air, "I miss you, Robert, every single day." As her words faded into the quiet, her cane slipped and hit something hard beneath the dock. At first, she thought it was just a rock lodged in the soil, but when she leaned closer, she saw something unusual, a corner of wood worn but unmistakably man-made, poking out of the dirt. Curiosity overtook her grief as she reached down to brush away the earth. It wasn't easy. The years had buried it deeply, and her hands trembled with the effort. After several minutes of digging, she unearthed a small wooden box, its surface scratched and its metal hinges rusted with age. She stared at it, her heart pounding. What was it doing here? Why would Robert have buried something at the edge of his fishing spot? The box was surprisingly light in her hands, almost as if it were empty. She hesitated, feeling a strange sense of intrusion. Was she meant to find this? Or had Robert buried it for reasons he never intended her to uncover? The thought sent a chill down her spine, but the need to know overwhelmed her. She pried open the fragile lid, wincing as the hinges creaked. Inside, she found a photograph. It was old and faded, but the image was unmistakable. Robert, much younger, standing beside a woman Martha didn't recognize. He was smiling, his arm draped casually around her shoulders, his eyes twinkling in a way that made Martha's chest tighten. Beneath the photo were scraps of paper covered in strange numbers and symbols, like a code she couldn't decipher. There was also a small, tarnished key, unlike any she had seen before. It was ornate, with an intricate design that suggested it belonged to something important. Her fingers brushed against the lid of the box, where she noticed something scrawled in faint pencil. "For when the time is right." The phrase sent a shiver through her. What did it mean? Why had Robert left this here, hidden in the one place he loved most? Martha's mind raced with questions. Who was the woman in the photo? What did the strange papers mean? And why had Robert never mentioned any of this during their years together? The discovery shattered the image she had held of him, the man she thought she had known so completely. For the first time in decades, she felt both exhilarated and unnerved. The fishing spot, once a place of solace, now felt like the starting point of a journey she never expected to take. As she packed the box carefully into her bag and made her way back to the car, Martha couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at the lake. It seemed different now, no longer just a reflection of the sky, but a mirror of her husband's secrets. Whatever answers the box held, Martha knew one thing for certain: she could not let this mystery rest. The man she had loved for 50 years had hidden a part of himself from her, and now it was up to her to uncover the truth. The wooden box haunted Martha's thoughts as she drove home. It sat on the passenger seat, an unassuming thing for something so heavy with unanswered questions. The faded photograph and strange papers seemed to speak to her, teasing her with fragments of a story she didn't understand. When she pulled into her driveway, the world around her felt quieter than usual. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across her front porch. She hesitated before stepping out of the car, staring at the box as if it might vanish if she looked away. Finally, with a deep breath, she gathered it up and carried it inside. Martha placed the box carefully on the dining table, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the photograph again. The woman in the picture was young, with soft curls framing her face and a smile that felt achingly familiar. There was something about her that tugged at Martha's memory, though she couldn't quite place it. The scraps of paper were equally puzzling, numbers, symbols, and what looked like coordinates, though they meant nothing to her. The key, however, intrigued her most of all. It was small but ornate, with delicate engravings along its shaft, as if it belonged to something precious. She spent the rest of the evening poring over the contents of the box, but no answers came. Exhausted and frustrated, she decided to sleep on it, hoping the morning would bring clarity. That night, her dreams were restless and vivid. She saw Robert standing by the lake, his fishing pole in hand and his back turned to her. When she called out to him, he didn't respond. Instead, he bent down, as if reaching for something, and disappeared into the water without a word. Martha woke with a start, her heart pounding and her throat dry. The next day, she couldn't shake the feeling that the box was only the beginning. She decided to search their home for more clues, starting with the attic, where Robert had always stored his personal belongings. The attic was a time capsule of their life together. Old suitcases, holiday decorations, and boxes of photographs from a world that felt both familiar and distant. As she sorted through the clutter, she stumbled upon a small locked trunk she hadn't seen in years. The sight of it sent a jolt through her, and she instinctively reached for the key from the wooden box. Her hands trembled as she turned the key in the lock. It fit perfectly, clicking open with a soft metallic sound. Inside the trunk, she found a neatly wrapped bundle of papers and a worn leather-bound journal. The journal's cover was cracked and faded, but Robert's handwriting was unmistakable on the first page. For Martha, when the time is right. The phrase mirrored the words on the lid of the wooden box, and it took her breath away. Why had he hidden this from her? What secrets could be so important that he couldn't share them during their decades together? Martha opened the journal, her heart pounding with anticipation. The pages were filled with Robert's familiar scrawl, but the contents were anything but familiar. The entries began decades before they met, detailing a life she had never known. Robert wrote about his younger years with startling honesty, describing his struggles, his dreams, and most shockingly, a relationship with another woman, a woman named Evelyn. The name hit Martha like a blow. Evelyn. Was she the woman in the photograph? As Martha read further, the story unfolded. Robert and Evelyn had been deeply in love, but their relationship had ended abruptly and tragically. He didn't provide many details, only alluding to a loss too great to bear. One entry, written years later, revealed that Evelyn had given birth to a child, a son Robert never had the chance to know. The revelation made Martha's breath catch. A son? Her Robert had a child she had never known about? The journal painted a picture of a man haunted by his past. Robert wrote of his regrets, his longing to reconcile with his lost family, and his decision to bury the memories to protect the life he built with Martha. "You deserve all of me, not just the broken parts," he had written in one entry. But now those broken parts were laid bare, and Martha didn't know what to feel. She had loved Robert deeply, believed in the life they had shared, but this journal made her question how well she had truly known him. As the sun set outside her window, Martha closed the journal, her hands shaking. The words on the pages had shattered the image she had of her husband, yet they also revealed a depth to him she hadn't fully understood. He wasn't just the man she had married. He was a man who had endured loss, made sacrifices, and carried secrets to protect the people he loved. Martha spent the rest of the evening piecing together what she had learned. The journal mentioned a box of keepsakes hidden somewhere in the attic, mementos of Robert's life before her. She searched for hours, finally uncovering a dusty shoebox tucked behind a stack of old books. Inside, she found more photographs, letters, and a small map marked with the same coordinates she had seen in the wooden box. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was far from complete. As Martha sat surrounded by the remnants of Robert's hidden past, she realized she had a choice to make. She could lock everything back in the trunk and leave the past buried, or she could follow the trail he had left and uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Taking a deep breath, Martha folded the journal and placed it carefully in her lap. "You wanted me to find this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm ready, Robert, but I'll try." The words felt like a promise, one she wasn't sure she could keep. But deep down, she knew she couldn't stop now. The man she loved had left her a mystery, and she owed it to him and to herself to see it through. The journal stayed on Martha's bedside table for days, a silent presence that both comforted and unnerved her. She had read it twice now, lingering over every word, every confession, every hint of a life her husband had kept hidden. Yet, it was the entries about Evelyn and the child that refused to leave her mind. Robert's words were filled with longing and regret, describing the son he never met as the piece of my soul left behind. There was no name, no clear indication of where the child might have grown up, but the map she found in the shoebox suggested the fishing spot wasn't just a place of solace. It was a waypoint in a journey Robert had never finished. Martha couldn't ignore the pull to learn more, but she also couldn't do it alone. At 80, her body wasn't as willing as her mind, and the thought of sifting through the past felt overwhelming. That's when she thought of her grandson, Jack. Jack had always been curious and tech-savvy, with a knack for solving puzzles. He was also the only family member who wouldn't dismiss her feelings as the sentimental musings of an old woman. With some hesitation, she picked up the phone and dialed his number. "Grandma." Jack's voice was warm and familiar, instantly putting her at ease. "What's up? Everything okay?" "I need your help," Martha began, her voice steadier than she expected. "It's about your grandpa." She explained the barest details, finding the box, the journal, and the mention of a child Robert had before their marriage. Jack listened intently, interrupting only to ask clarifying questions. By the time she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. While he finally said, "I had no idea Grandpa had this whole other life. Are you sure you're ready to dig into this? It sounds big." Martha sighed. "I'm not sure about anything anymore, Jack. But I think your grandpa wanted me to find this. He left too many breadcrumbs for it to be a coincidence. I need to see it through." Jack agreed to come over that weekend, bringing his laptop and an eagerness that reminded Martha of Robert's youthful enthusiasm. Together, they spread out the clues on the dining table: the journal, the map, the photograph, and the cryptic papers from the wooden box. Jack immediately focused on the numbers, recognizing them as GPS coordinates. "Grandma, these are locations," he said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "See here. This one points to the lake, but the others, they're spread out. There's one in Illinois, another in Missouri. Wait, this one is in Texas." "Texas?" Martha echoed, her brow furrowing. Robert had never mentioned traveling to Texas. What could possibly connect him to a place so far from their quiet life in Wisconsin? As Jack continued digging, he discovered something even more startling. The coordinates in Texas led to a small-town cemetery, and an old obituary listed an Evelyn Mitchell buried there. The dates matched the time frame Robert had written about in his journal. Martha's heart sank as she processed the information. Evelyn was gone. She would never have the chance to meet the woman who had shared a part of Robert's heart. But Jack wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Evelyn had a son, a boy named Daniel. He was born in 1960, a year before you and Grandpa met." The name hit Martha like a thunderclap. Daniel. She rolled it over in her mind, trying to imagine what he might look like or how he might have grown up. Was he tall like Robert? Did he have his laugh? The thought made her chest ache with both curiosity and dread. "Do you think he's still alive?" Martha asked quietly. Jack nodded. "I think so. I found a record of him living in Chicago up until a few years ago. It's not much, but it's a start. If you want, I can try to find more." Martha hesitated. The idea of reaching out to a stranger who might be Robert's son felt overwhelming, even intrusive. But wasn't this what Robert would have wanted? He had written about his regrets, his longing to reconnect, but he had never been able to take the first step. Now that burden fell to her. "Let's see what else we can find," she said finally, her voice trembling with resolve. Over the next few days, Jack worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of Daniel's life through online records and newspaper archives. The picture that emerged was bittersweet. Daniel had grown up in Texas, raised by Evelyn alone after Robert's departure. He had served in the military, married, and had children of his own. But his life hadn't been easy. A divorce, financial struggles, and a period of estrangement from his own children painted a picture of a man who had faced a share of hardship. As Martha absorbed the details, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection to this man she had never met. He was a part of Robert, a piece of the puzzle she hadn't known was missing. But she also felt a pang of guilt. Would Daniel want to know about her? About the life she and Robert had shared? Or would her presence only reopen old wounds? One evening, as she sat by the fireplace with Jack, she voiced her concerns. "What if he doesn't want to meet me?" she asked softly. "What if this is too much for him?" Jack placed a reassuring hand on hers. "You won't know until you try, Grandma. And if he doesn't want to meet, at least you'll know you gave him the chance. Grandpa would want you to do this, for both of you." Martha nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She had always thought of herself as a practical woman, but this journey into Robert's past had stirred emotions she wasn't prepared to face. Still, she knew Jack was right. This wasn't just about her or even Robert. It was about honoring the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As she stared into the flickering flames, Martha made her decision. She would reach out to Daniel, not just for Robert's sake, but for her own. The past was. Martha's decision to contact Daniel was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had spent days mulling over what she would say, rehearsing introductions in her head that ranged from formal to heartfelt. But every time she imagined his reaction, doubts crept in. Would he be angry? Would he even believe her? After all, she was a stranger to him, a reminder of a father who had been absent his entire life. Despite Jack's reassurances, the uncertainty gnawed at her. It was Jack who suggested they craft a letter instead of making a phone call. "It's less confrontational," he explained, tapping his laptop. "You can explain everything without catching him off guard. He'll have time to process it." Martha agreed, though she wasn't thrilled about writing something so deeply personal. Still, the letter gave her a chance to pour her thoughts onto paper, weaving together the story of Robert's life, the journal, and her desire to connect. She chose her words carefully, striking a delicate balance between honesty and empathy. "Dear Daniel," she wrote, "my name is Martha, and I was married to your father, Robert, for over 50 years. Recently, I discovered something about his past that I believe connects us. I found a journal he kept, and it mentions a son he never had the chance to meet. I believe that son is you. Please know that I am not trying to disrupt your life, but I felt it was important to reach out. If you're open to it, I would love to speak with you and share more about your father. He was a remarkable man, and I think he would want us to know each other. It took her 3 days to perfect the letter, during which Jack tracked down Daniel's address. He lived in a modest suburb outside of Chicago, according to the records Jack found. "We'll send it certified," Jack said. "That way, we'll know when he gets it." Martha nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought of waiting for a response. She mailed the letter the next day, standing at the post office counter longer than necessary, clutching the envelope as if it might be her last chance to connect with Robert's past. Jack reassured her that they had done everything they could, but the days that followed felt like an eternity. A week later, the reply came, not in the form of a letter, but a phone call. Martha was sitting by the window with a cup of tea when the phone rang. She almost didn't answer, thinking it was another telemarketer, but something told her to pick up. "Hello," she said, her voice steady but unsure. "Is this Martha?" a deep, hesitant voice asked. Her heart skipped. "Yes, this is she." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, the man spoke again. "This is Daniel. I got your letter." Martha's breath caught. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she managed to find her voice. "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you." Daniel chuckled softly, a sound that reminded her so much of Robert it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "I wasn't sure I'd call," he admitted. "This is a lot to take in. I didn't know what to think at first. But I read the letter a few times, and I figured you wouldn't have gone to all this trouble unless you were telling the truth." The conversation unfolded cautiously, like two strangers navigating unfamiliar terrain. Martha told him about Robert's journal, the wooden box, and the fishing spot where it all began. She described Robert as she had known him, kind, thoughtful, and deeply loyal. Daniel listened intently, asking questions here and there, but mostly letting her talk. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then Daniel said, "I've always wondered about him. My mom didn't talk about him much. She said he left before I was born, but I could tell she still loved him. I used to make up stories about him in my head, what he was like, why he left, but I never thought I'd get any real answers." Martha's voice softened. "I wish I could give you all the answers, Daniel. But what I do have, I want to share with you. Your father carried a lot of regret about leaving, but he also loved deeply. I think he was afraid of facing his past. I'm hoping we can piece together his story together." To her surprise, Daniel agreed to meet her. "I don't know what I'll find," he said, "but I think I need to know. For myself, for my kids. If there's even a small chance to understand where I come from, it's worth it." Jack offered to accompany her on the trip to Chicago, and Martha gratefully accepted. The drive felt surreal, a mix of anticipation and nervous energy. She clutched the journal tightly, knowing it would be the key to bridging the gap between her life and Daniel's. When they arrived at Daniel's house, she was struck by how ordinary it was: red brick with a white picket fence and a yard full of children's toys. A man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair stepped out to greet them, his posture slightly guarded but his eyes warm. Martha saw Robert in him immediately, the same strong jawline, the same piercing blue eyes. "Grandma," Jack whispered as they approached. "He looks just like Grandpa." The meeting began tentatively, with polite introductions and awkward small talk. But as Martha pulled out the journal and shared more of Robert's words, the walls between them began to fall. Daniel's face softened as he listened, his eyes misting over at passages that spoke of Robert's love for Evelyn and the son he never knew. For hours they talked, About Robert, about Evelyn, about the lives they had all lived separately. Jack chimed in occasionally, offering insights from his research, but mostly it was Martha and Daniel, two strangers bound by a shared loss and a shared love. By the end of the evening, they weren't strangers anymore. As Martha prepared to leave, Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for finding me, for sharing this. I didn't realize how much I needed it." Martha smiled through her tears. "I think we both needed it, Daniel. And I think Robert would be glad we found each other." The connection between Martha and Daniel grew in the days following their meeting. They began to talk regularly, their conversations filled with stories, questions, and shared reflections on Robert. Despite the heavy truths they were uncovering, there was an unspoken warmth between them, a bond born from their mutual longing for the man who had left them both with unanswered questions. But just as Martha started to feel a fragile sense of peace, another discovery threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew. It happened one afternoon while Martha was going through more of Robert's belongings. Daniel had expressed interest in seeing some of Robert's old photographs, and Martha had promised to send him anything she found. She decided to search through a chest in the attic, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside were albums filled with snapshots of family vacations, birthdays, and quiet moments she had nearly forgotten. But tucked beneath the albums was something else, a single yellowed envelope, sealed but never sent. The envelope was addressed in Robert's familiar handwriting. The recipient, Evelyn Mitchell. Martha froze, her fingers trembling as she held it. Why had Robert written to Evelyn? And why had he never sent the letter? She debated whether to open it, feeling as though she were trespassing on something deeply personal. But the pull of its secrets was too strong. With a deep breath, she carefully tore the envelope open, her heart pounding as she unfolded the brittle paper inside. The letter began simply, "Dear Evelyn, I've thought about writing this letter 1,000 times, and every time I've convinced myself not to. But the truth is, I've never stopped thinking about you, or about the life we could have had together. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and not a day goes by that I don't regret it. I've told myself it was the right thing to do, but I wonder if I was just a coward. I didn't know how to face the man I had become, or the life I had built on lies and mistakes. I know I can never make up for what I've done, but I want you to know that I loved you, Evelyn. I still do. And I loved our son, even though I never had the chance to know him. If there's even a small chance you can forgive me, I want to try to make things right. I don't know if it's too late, but I owe it to you and to Daniel to try. Robert." The letter left Martha reeling. She sat on the floor of the attic, the paper clutched in her hands as tears streamed down her face. The words were a knife to her heart, cutting through the years of love and trust she had built with Robert. He had loved Evelyn, perhaps as deeply as he had loved her, and he had carried that love with him until the end, never sharing it, never allowing her to see the full truth of his heart. For hours, she stayed in the attic, reading and rereading the letter. She tried to reconcile the man she had known with the man who had written these words. It wasn't that she doubted his love for her. She knew that love had been real. But it was clear now that Robert had lived with a divided heart, one half devoted to Martha and the other to a past he could never fully leave behind. When she finally came downstairs, the letter still in her hand, she called Jack. "I need to see Daniel," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Jack didn't ask questions. He drove her to Daniel's house the next day, his curiosity as sharp as his concern. When they arrived, Daniel greeted them warmly, but his smile faded when he saw the expression on Martha's face. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Martha hesitated, then handed him the letter. "I found this in Robert's things," she said softly. "I thought you should see it." Daniel took the letter with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the page. As he read, his expression shifted, confusion, pain, and a flicker of something Martha couldn't quite place. When he finished, he set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "I don't know what to say," he admitted after a long silence. "Part of me wants to be angry. He says he loved us, but he left. He had a chance to come back, to make things right, and he didn't." Martha reached for his hand. "I know," she said. "I've been asking myself the same questions. Why didn't he send it? Why didn't he try harder? But I think he was afraid. Afraid of facing you, of facing Evelyn, of facing himself. It doesn't excuse what he did, but maybe it explains it." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "It's strange. All my life, I've wanted to know more about him, and now that I do, I don't know what to feel. It's like he was two different people, the man you knew and the man I never got to meet." Jack, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "Maybe that's the point. He was both of those men. He made mistakes, but he also tried to do the right thing in his own way. Maybe this letter was his way of trying to bridge the gap, even if he never had the courage to send it." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Martha and Daniel exchanged a long look, their unspoken pain mirrored in each other's eyes. They both knew there were no easy answers, no way to fully reconcile the past. But there was something else in that shared look, understanding, and perhaps even forgiveness. Martha left the letter with Daniel, knowing it belonged to him more than it ever had to her. As they said their goodbyes, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The letter had opened old wounds, but it also brought them closer to the truth of who Robert was, a flawed, complicated man who had loved deeply and regretted fiercely. As she and Jack drove home, Martha stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. The past was still a puzzle, but piece by piece, it was coming together. And though the picture it painted wasn't perfect, it was real. The discovery of Robert's unsent letter deepened the bond between Martha and Daniel, but it also stirred up new questions that neither of them could ignore. For Daniel, the letter was a reminder of the father he had always longed to know, but never had the chance to confront. For Martha, it was a window into a part of Robert's heart she had never seen, a part that still seemed to belong to Evelyn. The letter had answered some questions, but it left so many more hanging in the air, unresolved and aching. It was Daniel who proposed they dig deeper. "I've been thinking about that journal and the map you found," he said one evening during a phone call with Martha. "There's something about those coordinates that doesn't sit right with me. Why would he write them down if they didn't mean anything? What if there's more to the story, something he wanted us to find?" Martha hesitated. The idea of following Robert's trail felt both exciting and overwhelming. She had already uncovered so much, and part of her feared what might come next. But another part of her, a part that had grown stronger with each revelation, knew she couldn't stop now. "If you think it's worth looking into, then I trust you," she said finally. "What's our next step?" Jack, ever the problem solver, offered to help again. "We can start by visiting the places on the map," he suggested. "There's one not far from here, near a small town outside of Springfield. It's a day's drive at most." Martha agreed, and a week later, she, Jack, and Daniel set out on a road trip that felt as much like a journey into the past as it did a physical one. The drive was quiet at first, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But as they neared the location marked on Robert's map, a sense of anticipation began to build. The coordinates led them to a small, overgrown field on the edge of town, bordered by a dense grove of trees. There was no sign of anything significant. No buildings, no landmarks, just a clearing that looked like it had been untouched for decades. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Martha asked, glancing at Jack, who was studying his GPS. "This is it," Jack confirmed. The coordinates match exactly. Daniel scanned the area, his expression unreadable. "What are we supposed to be looking for?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Martha didn't have an answer, but something about the place felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. She wandered toward the grove of trees, her steps slow and deliberate. The air was cool and quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. She stopped suddenly, her eyes catching a faint glint of metal buried in the dirt. "Over here," she called, motioning for Jack and Daniel to join her. They knelt beside her as she brushed away the soil, revealing the corner of a small metal box. It was rusted and weathered, but its shape was unmistakable, a lockbox, much like the one she had found at the lake. Jack helped her pry it open, revealing its contents, a stack of faded letters, carefully tied together with a ribbon, and a single photograph. The photograph was of Robert and Evelyn, standing together in front of a small house. Their smiles were radiant, their arms wrapped around each other. But it was the letters that drew Martha's attention. She untied the ribbon with trembling hands and began to read the first one. "My dearest Evelyn," it began, "I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send this, but I need to put these words down, if only for myself. I think about you every day. I think about Daniel and the life we might have had together. Leaving you was a choice I made out of fear, and it's a choice I will regret for the rest of my life. I hope you can forgive me, though I don't expect you to. Please know that I never stopped loving you, and I never stopped loving our son." The letters were a painful reminder of Robert's divided heart, but they were also a testament to the depth of his love for Evelyn, for Daniel, and in his own way for Martha. As she read them, tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of anger or betrayal. They were tears of understanding. Daniel, too, was visibly moved. He read one of the letters silently, his lips tightening as he absorbed his father's words. "He wanted to come back," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wanted to be part of our lives. But he was too afraid." Jack spoke up, his tone thoughtful. Maybe this place was his way of holding on to that part of his life. He couldn't be with you, but he couldn't let go of you either. It's like he left pieces of himself behind, hoping someone would find them one day. The idea struck Martha deeply. She thought about all the years she and Robert had spent together, all the times he had disappeared into his thoughts, his eyes distant as if looking at something or someone she couldn't see. She had always assumed those moments were about work or stress, but now she realized they had been about Evelyn and Daniel. As they packed up the letters and photograph, Daniel turned to Martha. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "for bringing me here, for sharing this with me. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand him, but this helps." Martha placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but gentle. "We may never understand everything about him, Daniel, but I think we're starting to see him for who he really was, and that's what matters." The drive back was quieter than the drive there, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with a sense of resolution. They had uncovered another piece of Robert's story, and while it was painful, it was also healing. For the first time, Martha felt like she was truly beginning to let go, not of Robert, but of the image of him she had clung to for so many years. As they neared home, she looked out the window at the setting sun, its warm light spilling across the horizon. "I think we're getting closer," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "Closer to understanding him, and closer to understanding ourselves." After uncovering the letters and photograph, Martha thought they had reached the end of Robert's story. The letters felt like a conclusion, a bittersweet testament to the man he had been and the regrets he had carried. But Daniel wasn't convinced. "There's still one set of coordinates we haven't checked," he reminded her one evening. "The ones near the fishing spot. Don't you think it's worth looking into?" Martha hesitated. The fishing spot held so many memories, both joyful and painful. Returning there once had been hard enough, but going back again, this time with Daniel, felt like a final step she wasn't sure she was ready to take. Yet, deep down, she knew Daniel was right. Robert's trail of clues had led them this far, and there was no turning back now. With Jack's help, they planned a trip to the lake. The three of them piled into Jack's car early one crisp autumn morning, the air thick with unspoken anticipation. The lake came into view as they rounded a bend in the road, its surface shimmering in the pale morning light. For Martha, the sight was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of the life she had shared with Robert and the secrets he had kept hidden. Daniel had never been to the fishing spot before, and as they walked toward the dock, he paused to take in the scenery. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "I can see why he loved it here." Martha nodded, her voice catching in her throat. It was his sanctuary. Whenever life felt too heavy, this is where he came to find peace. They reached the dock, and Jack pulled out the GPS to locate the exact coordinates. "It's close," he said, pointing toward a patch of tall grass near the shoreline. "Right over there." Martha and Daniel followed him, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. As they approached the spot, Jack stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing. "There's something buried here," he said, kneeling down to brush away the grass. Beneath the overgrowth, they found a small wooden plank, weathered and cracked. Jack lifted it carefully, revealing a shallow hole containing a metal box, much like the one they had found in the clearing. Martha's breath caught as she knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for the box. "Go ahead, Grandma," Jack said gently. "This one's for you." With Daniel and Jack watching, Martha opened the box. Inside was a collection of items that seemed ordinary at first glance, a fishing lure, a small notebook, and a stack of photographs. But as Martha sifted through the contents, her eyes widened. The photographs were of Robert, Evelyn, and a young boy, Daniel, as a child. There were snapshots of birthday parties, family outings, and quiet moments that painted a picture of a life Robert had been part of, if only for a brief time. Martha's hand shook as she held the images, her heart breaking for the man who had carried this secret for so long. The notebook was even more revealing. Its pages were filled with Robert's thoughts and reflections, written in the years after he had left Evelyn and Daniel. "I came here to think," one entry read, "to remember the life I left behind and the family I abandoned. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope that one day Daniel will know that I loved him. I hope he will understand that leaving was the hardest decision I ever made." Tears streamed down Martha's face as she read. The notebook was a confession, a testament to Robert's deepest regrets and his enduring love for both his past and his present. It was clear that the fishing spot had been more than just a place of peace for him. It had been a place of reckoning. Daniel, too, was overcome with emotion. He picked up one of the photographs, studying the faces of his younger self and his parents. "He was there," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "He was part of my life, even if I didn't know it. He loved us. He really did." Martha placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. "He did, Daniel. He loved all of us. But he was a man torn between two worlds, and I think he never figured out how to bring them together." As they sat by the lake, the three of them sifted through the box's contents, piecing together the fragments of Robert's story. It was a story of love and loss, of mistakes and redemption, and of a man who had tried, in his own flawed way, to do right by the people he cared about. But one item in the box stood out, a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the photographs. Martha unfolded it carefully, heart racing as she read the words written in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. "To Martha and Daniel, if you're reading this, it means you've found the truth. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you myself, but I hope you can understand why. My love for you both was never divided, it was whole, but it was also complicated. I didn't know how to be the man you both deserved, so I made choices that I will regret for the rest of my life. But please know this, you were my greatest joys and my greatest sorrows. I hope that in finding this, you can find peace, and maybe even each other." The note left them speechless. It was the final piece of Robert's puzzle, a message that tied together the loose threads of his life and gave Martha and Daniel the closure they had been seeking. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting golden light across the water, Martha turned to Daniel. "I think he wanted us to find each other," she said softly. "I think this was his way of bringing us together, even if he couldn't do it himself." Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening. "I think you're right, and I think he'd be proud of us for finding the strength to face the truth." For the first time in weeks, Martha felt a sense of peace wash over her. The fishing spot, once a place of memories and mystery, had become a place of healing. And as she sat there with Daniel and Jack, she realized that Robert's story wasn't just about the past. It was about the future they would build together, as a family united by love, forgiveness, and the courage to move forward. The discovery at the fishing spot had brought Martha and Daniel closer than ever before, but it also left them with a heavy decision. Robert's notebook, the photographs, and his final note had answered many of their questions, but they had also revealed the depth of his secret. Now Martha and Daniel faced a moral dilemma. Should they share what they had uncovered with the rest of the family, or keep it between themselves, protecting Robert's legacy while carrying the burden of his truth? Martha felt the weight of the decision more keenly than anyone. Robert had been her husband, her partner for over 50 years, and the father figure to their children and grandchildren. To reveal his hidden past would change the way everyone remembered him. Would they still see him as the loving, devoted man she had always known him to be, or would his mistakes and regrets overshadow everything else? Daniel, too, wrestled with the implications. Though he had grown closer to Martha and found solace in the truth of his father's love, he couldn't ignore the pain of Robert's absence during his childhood. Sharing the story might bring closure to others, but could also stir resentment and reopen old wounds. One evening, as they sat together in Martha's living room, Daniel broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what to do," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Part of me wants to tell everyone, your kids, your grandkids, so they can know the truth about who Robert really was. But another part of me wonders if it's better to leave it alone. He kept this secret for a reason." Martha nodded, her gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. "I've been asking myself the same thing," she admitted. "Robert wasn't perfect, but he was good. He loved his family, even if he didn't always show it the right way. I don't want to tarnish that memory for anyone." Jack, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Maybe it's not about protecting his memory," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's about what his story can teach us. Grandpa's life wasn't just about his mistakes. It was about how he tried to make up for them, even if he didn't always succeed. Maybe sharing this isn't about tearing him down. It's about showing how complicated love and family can be." His words hung in the air, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then Martha sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that comes from carrying too much for too long. "Maybe you're right, Jack," she said softly. "Maybe this isn't just about Robert. Maybe it's about us, about how we move forward as a family." Together, they decided to gather the family for a meeting. Martha spent the next few days preparing, organizing the letters, photographs, and Robert's notebook into a coherent narrative. She rehearsed what she would say, knowing that the truth would be difficult for some to hear. When the day of the meeting arrived, the living room was filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter as her children and grandchildren gathered, unaware of the reason for the reunion. Martha felt a pang of anxiety as she looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the faces of the people she loved most. Once everyone had settled, she stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped tightly. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "There's something I need to share with you, something I've recently discovered about your father, your grandfather. It's not an easy story, but it's an important one." She began with the fishing spot, describing how she had found the wooden box and the journey it had set her on. She shared Robert's journal, the letters to Evelyn, and the photographs of Daniel as a child. Her voice wavered at times, but she pressed on, determined to honor Robert's memory while being honest about his flaws. When she finished, the room was silent. Her children exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to sadness. Finally, her eldest son, Michael, spoke. "So, all this time, he had another family? Another son?" Martha nodded. "Yes, but it wasn't as simple as that. Robert made mistakes he regretted deeply. He loved us, but he also loved Evelyn and Daniel. He carried that love with him every day, even if he didn't know how to express it." Daniel, who had been sitting quietly, stood and faced the family. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said. "Believe me, it's been overwhelming for me too. But I want you to know that I'm not here to disrupt your lives or take anything away from you. I just wanted to understand my father, to know the man he was. And I found that through Martha and through all of you." Jack stepped in, his voice steady and calm. "Grandpa's story isn't just about the past. It's about how we choose to move forward. We can let this divide us, or we can let it bring us closer. It's up to us." The room remained tense for a few moments longer, but then something shifted. Martha's youngest granddaughter, Emily, stood and walked over to Daniel. "You're part of this family now," she said simply, her smile warm and genuine. Grandpa would have wanted that. One by one, the rest of the family followed her lead, welcoming Daniel with open hearts. The tension eased, replaced by a sense of connection and understanding that hadn't been there before. Later that evening, as the family shared stories and laughter around the dinner table, Martha felt a deep sense of peace. Robert's story had been painful, but it also brought them closer together, redefining what family meant. As the night wore on, she sat quietly by the window, watching the moonlight ripple across the lake. "You were right, Robert," she whispered, a soft smile on her lips. "Love isn't perfect, but it's what holds us together, even when everything else falls apart." And in that moment, she felt him with her, not as a man divided, but as a man whose love had brought his family together in the end.